Street Fighter EX3, an exclusive launch title for the Sony PlayStation 2, the best-selling game console of all time. But despite such a fighter being produced to be experienced on the most highly anticipated system that had ever been made, hardly anyone would choose to buy this game, with most consumers choosing to ignore its existence completely. So this meant that despite the Street Fighter brand being incredibly well known and being released on hardware that had a greater reach than any platform previously, very few people seemed to give a crap about this game. Holding these thoughts, bearing in mind that we would not get a new Street Fighter game for years after this one, did this overlooked title provide enough evidence to Capcom to kill off new Street Fighter games? Let's explore this story to see what you think. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of Street Fighter EX3, the end of an era. Yeah. Overall, the Street Fighter EX series is a selection of fighting games the general gaming population do not seem to acknowledge much in comparison to other titles that carry the Street Fighter name. However, out of the 3 titles, EX3 seems to be the most overlooked of all. But to understand how we got to EX3, let's first briefly recap as to why the other games in the series were released in the first place.
Listen up. We will not live in a two-dimensional world. We won't go in one direction or seek where we can say.
As discussed a lot on here already, back in 1996, many franchises throughout the gaming world were changing gameplay and presentation styles, opting for newly popular 3D graphics. As for Capcom, they were not confident that they could do the Street Fighter series justice when using such a style, so when releasing the next mainline entry in the series, Street Fighter 3, it would appear in a more traditional 2D style, featuring sprite-based graphics. Speaking of sprite-based games, although the Street Fighter 3 games didn't sell very well at the time, many fans now believe such offerings to be the peak of the series. Thankfully, you can see if this is true for yourself by playing the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection. This stunning compilation contains 12 titles, including the 1987 original, the Alpha Trilogy, multiple iterations of 2 and 3. Use my affiliate link to get all of these for a ludicrously low $7.07. But what's even better, you get up to 90% off thousands of other great games too, so be sure to have a look for yourself. Happy shopping! While these sprite-based offerings were the direction that Capcom themselves were pushing the series in, former Capcom employee and member of the Street Fighter 2 development team, Akira Nishitani, had other ideas, which would result in him and his company, Arika, co-producing his own Street Fighter game with Capcom. This title would of course be Street Fighter EX, a game that featured 3D polygons which was developed to run on Sony ZN hardware. This would result in the game being easily ported to the Sony PlayStation, giving the game a much wider audience than what was available with Street Fighter 3. A game that at first could only be experienced in arcades before being ported to the underperforming Dreamcast. As for Street Fighter EX, it sold well enough to deem it worthy of a sequel, so 2 years later, in 1998, Street Fighter EX2 would hit the arcades. Whilst the first EX game was a breath of fresh air for the franchise, the second installment offered very little in terms of new features. A dash of new fighting mechanics were added, graphics were slightly improved, and a couple of new characters were included, but all in all, it was simply much of the same. As we know though, this would not spell the end for the EX sub-brand, as the third game in the series, Street Fighter EX3, would arrive another 2 years later in the year 2000. We have a lot to talk about this game, so to get you in the mood, let me show you the game's introduction. From the game's introduction, you would have instantly noticed that graphically, the visuals in the game were a massive step up from Street Fighter EX2, and the duel that ensues between Ken and Ryu looks graphically much more impressive than ever before. When it comes to Street Fighter games being presented in the third dimension, this was the best the brand had looked as of yet. But EX3 offers way more than simply graphical improvements. As you can see from the character select screen, the game features a sizable roster of fighters with a lot of different characters to choose from. Including unlockables, this game features a whopping 28 different fighters total, which is a decent amount. Like previous EX games, the characters mix a range of fighters from classic Street Fighter games together with a bunch of characters created by Arika of the series. This of course includes everybody's favourite Arika fighter, Skullomania, a man who, as you know, I simply can't get enough of. Outside of just the graphical improvements, the title also marked a number of changes for the series, the first of which being the fact that we mentioned it being released on the Sony PlayStation 2, which straight away explains the huge graphical improvements over the game's predecessors. Perhaps more interestingly, unlike other fighting games I've covered on this channel, this game is an exclusive and only appeared on the PS2 and no other platforms. In fact, even more surprisingly, the game did not even see an arcade release, meaning that this was the first game featuring Street Fighter characters that could only be experienced in the home. I guess this was because by the time the PS2 was launched, arcades were slowly becoming less and less relevant, and Sony was set to make so much money with the PS2. It could be argued that them bothering with arcade hardware at that time would have been a trivial pursuit at best in comparison. Still though, while this was the case, Capcom fighters that year remained in arcades, with Marvel vs Capcom 2 and Capcom vs SNK both seeing release on the Sega Dreamcast arcade counterpart, the Sega Naomi, around the time frame. The Dreamcast really was the last console ever made that featured the old school mentality of bringing the arcade experience home. In that regard, you've got to love that system. With regards to EX3 though, despite its graphical differences, like other titles in the series, the game is yet another 2D head-to-head fighting game. The game would see release in Japan in March of the year 2000, October 2000 as a North American launch title, and the game would reach Europe in March of 2001. Whilst graphics in the game have been massively improved, many of the mechanics found in Street Fighter EX2 had been directly carried over to this game. This meant that both super combos and meteor combos made a return, but there are still some differences. A big change, for example, is that guard breaks had been completely removed from the EX franchise, and instead a similar system known as surprise blows had been added in its place. The game also featured momentary combos, which enabled combinations or moves to be started, switched and restarted kind of like a super cancel. Many characters also had new moves, including Skullomania, who now had a vertical projectile, meaning there was a fair share of new features for experienced players to sink their teeth into. The game's main play mode is known as Original Mode and is drastically different from anything found in either of the previous EX games. After selecting a character, you quickly find yourself in a 3-on-1 encounter, an interesting concept which I'm surprised took this long to be placed within a Street Fighter game. After winning this bout, you then earn the opportunity to recruit one of your former opponents to your team, which means you guessed it, the game features traditional tag team action. Teddy Long would be proud. Holla holla holla. There is no doubt that tag team fighting was getting hot within the fighting game genre during this period. The Capcom Vs series, for example, was in full swing, and by this point, rival schools had received moderate success too, so I guess it just made sense to add this feature into Street Fighter EX3. In terms of a tag feature, the game introduces a mechanic known as the Critical Parade, which consists of your tag team partner battling your opponent simultaneously for a few seconds upon calling upon them, a rule taken straight from the Pro Wrestling Tag Team playbook. It's also worth mentioning that when experiencing Original Mode, after every encounter you have the opportunity to recruit opponents and can recruit up to 3 different partners as you make progress through this 6-bout quest. These fights are a mixture of different stipulation matches, from tag team bouts to team battles, and as mentioned earlier, even 2-on-1 and 3-on-1 matches. The variation from encounter to encounter makes me wonder whether the Street Fighter EX3 team took inspiration from the success of Super Smash Bros. On the Nintendo 64, which had been released in the previous year of 1999. Adding the fun features, the final stage of original mode places you in a one-on-one encounter with classic Street Fighter II boss M. Bison. Upon defeating him though, the end credits themselves deliver a slice of uniqueness by acting as a sort of bonus stage, if you will. As the credits roll, you are rewarded with an infinite combo meter and have the opportunity to take down as many weak generic fighters as possible. In fact, 6 or 7 of these are normally on screen against you at the same time, leaving plenty of room for some chaotic fun here. Within original mode, there are also secondary objectives, which the player can complete in order to gain platinum, gold, silver and bronze trophies, which in turn unlock various features. These additional challenges give the game an element of single player replayability that was not necessarily there with the first 2 games in the series. Aside from the original mode, other fighting modes in the game allow you to set up tag matches, team battles and even 4-player matches at will, allowing for a lot of options, especially when indulging in multiplayer fun. Outside of all of these play modes, the other standout feature to the game is the character edit mode, which is an extension to the game's expert mode, a play mode that had appeared in the first EX games previously. In this mode you play as Ace, a fairly generic looking fighter who is somewhat of a blank slate in that he has no special moves whatsoever. Special moves and super combos are acquired for Ace as you progress through this play mode. The moves can be purchased through the use of points, which are earned by completing achievement-like tasks, such as performing a 3-hit combo or executing a combo that does over 90 points of damage. Ace is a playable character in other modes in the game and becomes more and more useful depending on how much you have been grinding within this section of the game. So, as you can see from what we have covered so far, it looks like at the very least Arika were attempting to make an effort with the EX series, and attempted to do things with the game they had not tried out previously. Now with this knowledge in mind, it might have you wondering how those who did play this game perceived it at the time, so let's check out the critical response from the period. GameSpot would be fairly critical of the game, stating that Street Fighter EX3 takes the gameplay and additional moves of EX2, adds a tag team element similar to that of Capcom's own Marvel vs. Capcom, and drops it onto the PlayStation 2 for a quick and dirty fighting game that seems a little rushed but still manages to be a lot of fun. While the character graphics used in EX3 look pretty amazing when standing still, the animation is the same as it was in EX2. Granted, you can't exactly add lots of frames to all the special moves, and keep the game's timing as faithful to the Street Fighter series as 3 is. But now that the 3D Street Fighters don't look all blocky and pixelated, the jerky animation really stands out. It wouldn't just be the look of the game that GameSpot would be unimpressed with either, as they would also take pot shots at the sound, adding, the music doesn't always fit the action. Also, in an annoying demonstration of audio streaming, the music changes tunes on the fly when other characters get tagged in, so you never listen to one song for long. One track fades into another as soon as the action on the screen dictates a change. But amongst their critique, there would be a dash of praise too, when they would comment that Street Fighter EX3 is the game that EX2 should have and probably would have been had this kind of hardware power been available sooner. Their tag team fighting adds a nice new element that the previous game totally lacked. EX3 may feel a bit rushed in some spots, but overall it's a fun and great looking fighting game that won't disappoint long-time EX fans. So as you can see, GameSpot had some mixed thoughts on the game, generally praising the gameplay mechanics, but criticising the animation and music. All in all, resulting in them giving a pretty average score of 7.4 out of 10 for the game. IGN's perspective of the title though was even more negative, with them stating in their opening paragraph that Street Fighter EX3 comes with little fanfare. It's a mixed bag of good multiplayer action and a few luscious special effects, but uninspired basic combat coupled with stiff controls. It's certainly not the best of the series. In a nutshell, EX3 is 3D Street Fighter with tag team combat and multiplayer capabilities. The game uses some of the PlayStation 2's massive polygonal power, but rarely ever scratches the surface. Even though it's probably the best looking of the 3 in the series, EX3 simply feels rushed, uninspired, and downright mediocre. Although players might be instantly dazzled with the size and look of the Street Fighter characters, once you take a good look at them, the honeymoon quickly ends. Simple shaded characters that depend on boxy frames and bright colours simply don't do the imaginative former 2D characters any justice. All in all, Street Fighter EX3 keeps the tradition going, but not at its peak. Character response time isn't great. Even with the power of the PS2, it seems that the response time in a game such as Street Fighter Alpha 3 is better. The characters are all stiff and mechanical in movement. With the increased technical features of the PS2, most people would conclude that lightning quick movement and blindingly fast attacks would make this Street Fighter the best in the EX series. But that's far from the case. The character design and overall level of detail leaves much to be desired too. In the end, Street Fighter EX3 is a middle-of-the-road fighter that lacks pizzazz and inspiration. By this point you might think that it was all bad news for EX3, but some reception elsewhere for the game was more pleasant than what IGN brought to the table, with game critics stating that it had a group of pleasantly complex battlers that are very distinct in both visual and play design. Adding variety and flavour to the mix, the variances in philosophy and conceptualization are extremely refreshing. Adding that, the interestingly offbeat touches are far superior to the dull and ugly side of the spectrum found in Street Fighter 3. CNET would add that the tag team fighting adds a nice new element that the previous game totally lacked. EX3 may feel a bit rushed in some spots, but overall it's a fun and great looking fighting game that won't disappoint. So from all of this, as you can see, opinions were fairly mixed on the quality of Street Fighter EX3. The game certainly has its pros and cons to it. However, aside from everything else, I think there is one major reason that few people remember playing this game. Aside from the fact that there were probably over 20 fighting games that contained Street Fighter characters by this point in time, and people were generally a bit fed up with Street Fighter by the year 2000, the game was massively overshadowed by others, with one game in particular taking away its spotlight, which we will get to in a minute. But EX3 lacked in popularity due to more factors than competition from competing companies. One of these barriers the game faced could be argued came from the fact that the Street Fighter diehard fans had generally found a deep appreciation for Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, Marvel vs Capcom 2 and Capcom vs SNK by that point. All great fighting games with 2D graphics that offered a quick response time for competitive play. So what was left of the Street Fighter fandom by that point had moved on to those games. Compounding issues, the fact that Street Fighter now had 3D graphics had already had its wow moment with the release of the first EX game. So all this game really had that was new to the public was 3D Street Fighter with tag team mechanics. The big issue here though was that if someone wanted a great fighting game that offered 3D polygons and tag team action, EX3 wasn't the game that PlayStation 2 prospective buyers were excited about. That hype existed around Tekken Tag Tournament. As mentioned multiple times before on this channel, the PlayStation brand was the most popular entity in console gaming during the era, and the Tekken franchise was the most popular fighting game brand with the mass public over the period too. This meant that when Joe Public picked up a PS2 for the first time, they were highly likely to pick up Tekken Tag Tournament with it. When we bear in mind this was still a period when most gamers' collections were significantly smaller than today, most people were not interested in procuring more than one new fighting game at a time. So Street Fighter EX3 was left on shelves, in place of a much more desirable Tekken game. Apart from being a more popular brand at the time, the new Tekken game got better review scores across the board than EX3 as well, so the game was outmatched and outperformed on every level, finally bringing the run of Street Fighter EX games to a close. Still, the game does some interesting things and was certainly the best looking 3D Street Fighter game up until that point. However, with there being a constant glut of Capcom fighting games for over a decade solid, the mass public seemed to be tired of the Street Fighter brand and were no longer hungry for new entries. Anecdotes suggest that moving into the next few years, many believed at Capcom that there would never be a new numerical entry in the Street Fighter series, due to oversaturation completely burning the name out. So while we can't really be sure that EX3 was the title that broke the camel's back, there was certainly not a demand for games like that anymore. So therefore it served as perfect evidence to Capcom as to why it wasn't worth making more Street Fighters. Eventually we would of course receive Street Fighter 4, which ironically would be created due to Street Fighter 2 nostalgia kicking in, with the game picking up steam via Xbox Live. For Eureka though, they too somewhat returned to form, with beloved characters such as Skullomania returning in their 2018 game Fighting EX Layer, which is the spiritual successor to Street Fighter EX3. Speaking of a company's legacy, Arika also developed Tetris 99, the addictive Nintendo Switch Tetris game with added Battle Royale mechanics. The company are doing well today, and all of this started thanks to the successes of the original Street Fighter EX series, so the game's legacy remains important despite misfires. Remember, you can get up to 90% discounts off of thousands of games using my affiliate link, and with every purchase it goes towards supporting my work in the process. So do some binge shopping, grab some bargains, and enjoy some excellent titles all for next to nothing. Happy shopping, and I'll see you all soon. Cheerio!